Thank you for being here, right? We have this really unique opportunity to hear from somebody who lived through the events that you guys have been studying for so long. This is Mr. Paul Galan, and he has a really amazing story to share with you guys today. He's been here in the past. We felt so strongly that it was an amazing story. We wanted you guys to hear that. We asked him to come back again, and he was gracious enough to say yes. I know you guys are going to be a terrific learning and listening audience. If you have questions, I think you can try to hold them to the end. If it's a burning question and you have a way to respectfully signal that, I think that that's okay too. But there is a flow to the story we want to try to respect. That door is going to need to be closed, guys, because the seventh graders are seventh graders.
You guys are much older, bigger, more mature than the seventh graders.
Yeah. Some of you are seated beside some of your friends, and that's, in some cases, that's okay. In some cases, we want to make sure that we're focusing our entire attention on the story of Mr. Galan. So, settle in. The story's going to take a little while to unfold. We've talked about that, and stay with us and listen for the details and listen to the amazing events that transpired in this man's life and lifetime. And having said that, this is Mr. Galan. Thank you for being here.
I'm sorry, what? Hi, everybody.
Hello.
It's nice to be back here again. Is it okay where I'm sitting? I'll try not to drive you crazy by getting up, but I'll sit most of the time. I like being at eye level with everybody. So, I don't know how much you've learned about the events of the Holocaust, how much you know about it, but the stories are so many different ones, because every single person who survived the Holocaust really has or had a different story to tell, because survival was such a unique thing. So few people managed to survive, and at times it took a great deal of luck to survive, and other times it took a great deal of ingenuity. And if you believe in God, God helped a lot of people to survive. But the truth was that in spite of the number of people who did manage to survive, over 6 million people were murdered. And when I think about it, how it could have happened, I find it very difficult to comprehend. I just find it very hard to understand how a group of people could possibly decide that they're going to get rid of a whole race, a whole group of millions of people, wipe them off the face of the earth just because of lots of fairy tales, stories, whatever you want to call it, as to why that group of people they were going to eradicate were not good enough to be alive, not good enough to be part of the world, not good enough to be part of society or cultures. It's hard to understand how they could organize an effort such as the Holocaust to eradicate, to wipe off millions of people. And the methods that they developed, that they really dreamt up for accomplishing it, the methods that they dreamt up for getting rid of millions of human beings, just because supposedly, we were not good enough to be living. We were not good enough to be part of society. We were not good enough to be part of the world. What human being has the right to make such a decision to begin with? What group of human beings have the right to make such decisions? We talk about things happening in this country. People who are demented and they go and they shoot up a school. Well, the only excuse for that is the fact that they probably demented or so full of hatred. So they take it out on a small group. But just think, one nation, one country, Germany, which was the most civilized country in all of Europe in those days, technologically, educationally, culturally, literature-wise, in music, in all respects, they decide, we're going to get rid of all these people. If you think about it, is that something that you can even conceive of how it could be done? And that's exactly what they tried to do. That's exactly what Nazi Germany tried to do. And that's exactly what they almost succeeded in doing. Almost. You know, the Nazis were, the countries that they invaded, if you know the history of World War II, went into different countries, and in the capitals of those countries they saved certain buildings that were beautiful, big old buildings, suitable to be museums, and they were going to turn them into museums of an extinct race. Just think about that. A museum of an extinct race. A race that was part of the world that they were living in. And that is what we were subjected to. That fear, that danger, that threat of being eliminated, being killed, being wiped off the face of the earth. And I was a kid in those days. I was a young boy, 6 years old, when I was told by the law that I have to wear a yellow star, which designated me as being one of those people who were going to be eradicated, who were going to be wiped off the face of the earth. Now, of course, I didn't know that that's what it was all about. I was too young to understand. And it was a deep, dark secret that people were going to be killed. Because the Nazis had all kinds of names for what they were going to do. They were going to resettle people, send them to perform labor, forced labor, move them to another part of Europe where they would be separated and isolated from the rest of the country. All kinds of stories, they were all lies. All lies. But the ultimate plan was to kill everybody, to murder everybody. And they developed techniques and technologies and ways of doing it that it would be more efficient and that they could murder so many people in a day and so many people in a year and be able to do it faster and faster and faster until they've succeeded by eliminating the entire Jewish population of the world, not just Europe, because their plan was eventually to go to America, to conquer America, to conquer England, to conquer other countries. And the first thing they were going to do was murder all the Jews. And in some of the countries that the Nazis invaded at the very beginning, like Poland and Russia, the first thing they did was they rounded up the Jewish people. And they brought them to forests where whatever they were going to do was not to be seen. And they made these people, the Jewish people, dig these big ditches and line them up at these ditches and just machine gun them by the thousands, by the tens of thousands. That was the first thing they did in those countries. Now, I lived in a country called Czechoslovakia. Excuse me. Czechoslovakia used to be a democracy. It was a democratic country, just like the United States. We had all the freedoms. Freedom of observing any religion you belonged to, that you chose to. Whether you were Jewish or Lutheran or Protestant or Catholic or anything else, you could practice it. Because that's what democracy is all about. But the Nazis were able to conquer and dominate these countries very early on and take away the power of their government, or set up a government that was really just a puppet government that would carry out the orders of the Nazis and to carry out all these heinous crimes. Now, the country I lived in, Czechoslovakia, was a perfect example of that. Because whereas it was a democracy before the year 1939, after 1939, Nazi Germany took over Czechoslovakia, broke it up into two separate countries. One country called, which is now, today it's known as the Czech Republic, but at that time it was called Bohemia, was completely dominated by the Nazis, by the German Nazis, and they put in their own government or governor. And Slovakia, where we lived, where my family and I lived, where I was growing up, where I was born, Slovakia had a puppet government. You know what I mean by puppet government? That completely obeyed, was completely subject to the Nazi laws. And one of the first things that they did was they started clamping down on the Jewish population. And one of the first laws that they passed was that all Jews have to wear a yellow star and be branded. So when you went out in the street, you had to wear a yellow star, and it had the word Jew written in the middle of it. The yellow star, which was the Star of David, which is the symbol of the Jewish people. Today, that's the same star is the symbol of the state of Israel. But that time it was a bad thing. And your life was on the line the moment you put on the yellow star. And your life was on the line even if you didn't put on the yellow star, because they would throw you in jail for violating the law that required you to wear the yellow star. And life became very, very scary and very difficult for those of us who were Jewish. So I was a 6-year-old kid, as I said before. I had to wear the star. And I went out in the street, and other kids looked at me, and they saw the yellow star on my coat, and they called out to me, "You dirty, lousy, miserable Jew, go die." Or they would spit at me. Or they would jump me and beat me up in the street. I didn't know why they were doing it to me. You know? I was a 6-year-old kid. And so were all my friends. And the adults couldn't understand it either. I mean, they understood it better than 6-year-olds. But our lives were changed completely. And there's something that entered our lives that we never felt before to that extent. And that word is fear. Fear. You live in fear all the time. Fear of either getting beaten up in the street, or somebody calling you a dirty name, or somebody spitting at you, or the unknown, not knowing what's going to be the next thing that was going to happen to you. All Jewish kids were expelled from public schools. I had 2 older sisters. They were 9 years older than I. They were thrown out of school, so were all their friends. The Jewish community had to set up its own school system. if you had a business, if you were Jewish and you owned a business, whether it's a little store or a pharmacy or a big business, whatever the case may be, it was taken away from you. You were just told it's no longer yours. If you want to work there, fine, you can work there if the new owner is going to let you do it. But otherwise, we'll send you off someplace where you'll make yourself useful. Because the other thing was, the other myth was that Jews didn't work. That Jews didn't know what it meant to work. They were all lazy. They would take advantage of everybody else. Anything negative that the government could come up with about the Jewish people was being disseminated. And by the way, there was another small group that they were out to get, and they were called the Sinti Roma, or otherwise known as Gypsies. They were going to wipe them out, and they made no secret about that. So, I had a wonderful family. I had two twin sisters. My parents and I were the core family. Then I had an aunt, I had two aunts living in the same town. They were my father's sisters. One of them was married to a wonderful man who became my uncle, and they had a beautiful daughter. And my grandfather, who was already in his 80s. So that constituted my family. And when these things began happening, the things that I'm talking about, the persecution, the discrimination, the hatred, all Jewish people became very frightened because we had no recourse. We didn't know what to do. We didn't know how to protect ourselves. And we had no idea how much worse it was going to get. So, if those years mean anything to you, there's a chronology that I like to follow in telling the story because of the various events that I experienced. By 1940, which most of you must remember 1940, of course, I'm sure. Things were really getting rough. My father's business was taken away. My sisters were expelled from school. I was about to start first grade. I had to go to a school that was run by the Jewish community. The yellow stars were all over. You were not allowed to. There was a curfew. If you were Jewish, you could not be outside after 6 o'clock at night. During the day, you could not walk on one side of the main street, only on the other side. And initially, these restrictions were so ridiculous and so petty. And you wondered, why are they doing this? What are they accomplishing with this? And the whole idea behind it was to make you feel insecure, to dehumanize you, to make you feel less of a human being. And everybody who was of the Jewish faith was frightened. Going to services became a scary thing because sometimes young gangs would wait for you outside the synagogue and attack people, beat people up. Just for the heck of it. And have a good laugh doing it. And you couldn't quite defend yourself because if you did, then the police got after you. Or they would usually pick on a small number of people. 20 people against 2, 3. And beat people up in the street. And then then they started talking about, by they I mean the government, they started talking about something called resettlement. Now what was resettlement all about? Resettlement was something that people would be sent off to, let's say to Poland, which was a neighboring country, where there were big camps being set up by the Nazis. And you would live there and work there, and nobody would bother you. Well, the truth of it was that the plan was to send you to Poland, to send you to these camps and murder you. Yes, make you perform hard labor, be a slave, in effect. A slave laborer being fed minimal amount of nutrition in a day, like 160, 180 calories a day, until he became completely emaciated, skinny, disease-ridden, and then allowed to die. That was the better case. The worst case was when they started taking people away to these camps. They would take them off the train, separate older people and children from the stronger, healthier looking people, and take the children and the older people and the sick looking people and send them into gas chambers where they were murdered, and then cremated in huge crematoria where the Jewish people had to handle all the work of moving the bodies from the gas chambers to the crematoria and throwing them into the ovens. But this was all a deep, dark secret for a long time. Very few people knew about it because no one could escape. And we had a sense that things were getting bad. And we had a sense that we had to protect our lives. My father, being a businessman in a business that was unique, he was a grain merchant. He would buy grains from the farmers from the surrounding countryside and sell it to the mills. And grain was very important to the country because people eat grain. People eat flour, people eat all the products made from grains. It feeds the people, it feeds the country. So my father was considered an expert in this particular field. And even though his business was taken away from him, he was given a special, very unique thing, a special pass that enabled him to travel for business, and also it protected him and the family, meaning my immediate family, from being taken away, because they started deporting people by the thousands. By the thousands. There were raids in the middle of nights where people were rounded up and shipped out in freight trains to places unknown. And this accelerated, this picked up speed, and the more this was happening, the more scary the situation became. And my father luckily had this special document, but he no longer owned his business. A Christian man owned the business, and he was my father's boss, even though this used to be my father's business. So this document protected us for a while from being deported. Until one night, in the middle of the night, there was pounding on our front door, yelling, "Open up, open up, open up." This is the Hlinka Guard. The Hlinka Guard was a militia that was formed by the government, whose sole purpose was to deal with the Jewish people. And they pushed the door open, the front door. We were awakened in the middle of the night, and they started yelling and screaming at us to get dressed. Everybody can pack one bag, and you're being taken away for resettlement. So my father takes out this document that was issued by the government and shows it to the guards and says, "You can't do this to us, we are protected." And they looked at this document, they tore it to shreds, and they said, "Now, hurry up, everybody, you have to be done. We are taking you to the local school where you're going to be kept for a few days." And then shipped out for resettlement. So in the middle of the night, by this time I was 7 years old. This was 1942. In the middle of the night, we are marched by these guards carrying rifles and wearing black uniforms and taken to the local high school, where the schoolyard was already full of people, several hundred people who were already assembled there, sitting on the ground in the middle of the night. It was cold during the night. And we hear people crying, we hear children crying, and I see the guards picking people out of the crowd, men mostly, and forcing them to stand up and sing a song and dance to the song, which seems ridiculous, but that's what they were doing. And if you stopped, they started to beat you with nightsticks and started kicking you with their boots and punching people till they bled. And I'm watching all this, and you hear the sounds of crying and the screaming of the guards, and you hear all this, and you are so scared. You don't know what's going to happen to you. You don't know what they're going to do to you or to your father or whoever. And at one point they led my father away into the school building. And I was so worried. Where are they taking my father? What are they doing to him? And finally he came back after a long, what seemed like an eternity, and he was bleeding all over. They beat him up. His clothes were covered with blood. They just beat him up for absolutely no reason except that he was a Jew. And when I saw him, I became hysterical when I saw all that blood on him. My luck was that I had a wonderful family who were so loving and so caring that they always surrounded me and reassured me that everything is going to be all right. But deep down I knew that everything was not going to be all right. Because what you see and what you are told have different effects on you. And they kept us in the school for 2 days. On the third day, they started rounding us all up to be taken to the train station, which was on the outskirts of town. And just before that, they called our name. So my father identified himself. And they said, you take your family, you are free to leave. And we were shocked that they're letting us leave. And my father said, let's just go. Let's not ask any questions. Let's just get out of here. And went to the gate where the guard let us out. And standing outside the gate was my uncle. And he came over, he hugged us all. And he says, come, let me take you home. What happened, we asked. Don't ask, let me just take you home. They took us home to our apartment, which we found, the door was wide open, the front door. It was looted. Half the furniture was gone. Our belongings were gone. Things were broken. But my dad wanted to know, why did they take us away when I had this document? And how did you get us released? He said to my uncle. My uncle told the following story. unbeknownst to us, he had a pistol. He found out that the reason they took us away, in spite of my father's document, was the fact that the man who became the owner of the business, who initially knew nothing about grains, quality-wise, what to do with them, etc., 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 he learned enough where he felt he can get rid of my father. He went to the authorities and told them, you can take away the Jew. So they were happy to do it. My uncle found this out. He took his pistol, walked into this guy's office, pulled a gun on him, and threatened his life, and said to him, if you don't go back to the authorities and get them to release my brother-in-law and his family, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to walk with you. I'm going to walk with you. I'm going to hold my hand in my pocket with the gun. And I'll wait for you outside. And if you don't come out with a document ordering their release, I'll kill you. I don't care what happens to me. I will kill you. And this brave man carried out this act and got us released. But after that, we no longer trusted any passes or any documents that we were issued, because we knew that eventually every Jew was going to be taken away. And in those days we didn't know yet. We didn't know anything about what was going on in places like Poland in the camps, or in Germany in the camps. That was a deep, dark secret. We just knew that it wasn't good. So we were released. We tried to get back to normal life as much as possible. And my father was trying to find a way of safeguarding us, of protecting us. There were no ways of doing it except for one possibility. He was good friends with a Lutheran minister. And he asked this minister if he would issue us baptismal certificates stating that we had converted to Christianity. And the minister said, I will do it, but you must actually go through baptism. You have to convert and live as Christians. One of my sisters, Susan, she was always a fighter. She says, I'm not converting. I'm not changing my religion. I'm a Jew. I'll always be a Jew. If I have to die, I want to die as a Jew. So my father went back to see this minister and told him about my sister. And the minister said, all right, I'll tell you what. I have great respect for your daughter. If the rest of the family goes through baptism, your daughter won't have to do it. I'm going to issue her a baptismal certificate. And with that in mind, my sister agreed to it, and we went through baptism in a Lutheran church out in a nearby village. And this is a copy of my baptismal certificate. July 26, 1942, I became converted to Christianity. And we began living our lives as Christians. We completely left the Jewish faith behind, the practice of Jewish faith behind us. We started attending church. We observed all the holidays, Christmas, etc., etc., Easter, as Christians. And after about 6 or 7 months of living as Christians, the government decreed a new law. And the law was that any Jew who had converted to Christianity after the year 1939 is still considered a Jew and is still subject to all the laws pertaining to the Jewish population, including resettlement. And their conversion is not valid. So, on one hand, we were not too unhappy about going back to living our lives as Jews, but on the other hand, the fear increased even more. And there was no recourse, there was nowhere else that we could turn for any kind of help to save our lives. And meanwhile, we watched people being marched to the trains through our town on an ongoing basis. People from the town, people from the surrounding villages, all the Jewish people, they were being loaded into cattle cars and being shipped out. And most of them were never, ever heard from again. So, a little later that same year, 1943, we were at home on a Saturday afternoon. Most of our friends were gone. They were taken away. There were just a few of them left. My sisters had a few friends who were still left in town. On a Saturday afternoon, my sister Susan was visiting a friend when the police showed up at our house. And they announced to us that we are being taken away to a camp within Slovakia. It was a labor camp for Jews. Actually, that was the name of the camp. Novaki was the name of the camp, and it was called Novaki Labor Camp for Jews. It was in the western part of the country. And they wanted to know, where is my sister Susan? She wasn't at home. My father managed to tell a friend of hers who was visiting us, to tell this friend of hers to go find Susan and tell her not to come home, to go into hiding. That we're being taken away to hide somewhere and not to come home. And they took us, the rest of us, 4 of us, to the local jail, and we were locked up in the jail for several days while they were searching for my sister, and they couldn't find her. And they kept questioning us all the time. They would separate us. You know, I was the youngest, so I was the most vulnerable one. They would question me, where is your sister? You must know where your sister went. I didn't. I really didn't. And if I did, I wouldn't have told them. So for several days, they were searching for her and they're questioning us. And finally, they gave up and they took us under guard. They took the whole family, just us, by train to another part of the country where we were incarcerated in this camp. It was a labor camp. There were about 1,500 people living in this camp. We were surrounded by barbed wires. There were guard posts, towers all around the camp with armed guards. We were not free to leave. All adults had to perform one job or another. My father was given a hard job at first, and he had a physical disability. He couldn't really do it, so they reassigned him. My mother and my sister, Eva, they were working in a sewing shop, on sewing machines, making clothes. Kids went to a makeshift school, so I was able to go to a makeshift school. And we lived in this camp for a whole year. Our greatest fear was that we could be rounded up at any time and shipped out to Poland or wherever. to one of those worst resettlement camps. No one really knew what was going on. There were rumors, but no one really knew for a fact what was happening in those camps. And for a year we were living in this labor camp in Slovakia, and we were able to get news because people had some radios hidden away. So we kept track with the war, how the war was progressing. And for a while it was not going well because the Germans were really occupying all of Europe by that time, by 1943-44. And nothing was changing for us in the camp. But then in 1944, in the early part of it, there were rumors that were reaching us that the Allies, meaning the Americans and the British and the Russians, were going to invade mainland Europe because the Russians were now beating the Nazis in Russia. They were really beating the heck out of them. And so the Germans started retreating from Russia. And the Americans and the British landed on the coast of France in June of 1944 in Normandy. And that was the major invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. And we heard this news on hidden radios, and we were very happy because it gave us hope that the war might end soon. But we were still in the camp. But then the next thing that happened was they started an underground resistance movement. The Allies started an underground resistance movement against the pro-Nazi government. And paratroopers would drop into the country, and arms were sent into the country via parachutes. And an uprising against the pro-Nazi government took place. And that was the best news we could have possibly gotten. It gave us hope that the war might end soon for us. Meanwhile, there was fighting going on in all other parts of Europe, fighting against the Nazis. And we were hoping that something would happen within our country. And this uprising took place. The fighters in the uprising were the resistance fighters known as partisans. And they were being supplied by airdrop. And the fighting was taking place on a constant basis. We heard the sounds of battle in the camp. And then one morning we woke up and we found out that the camp was liberated. All the guards of the camp were arrested, locked up in one of the barracks, and we were free to leave the camp and go to a small region of the country that was liberated by the underground, by the resistance. So we were very happy, and we were hopeful that this revolution, if you will, would be successful, and that the whole country would become liberated. Well, that was not about to happen yet, because Germany, Nazi Germany, sent 50,000 troops into Slovakia to crush the uprising. And there was major fighting going on between the Germans, the Nazis, and the resistance fighters, and the pro-Nazi Slovak army. But one small region was liberated, and we had hoped that it would stay that way. We would hope that the resistance would defeat the others. Well, that was not about to happen, because the reinforcements that Germany sent in were so powerful and so big, and the arms were such good arms, that slowly they started to crush the uprising, to defeat the uprising against the Nazis. And finally, the day came where German troops were outside the city that we had escaped to. And there were German fighter planes flying over the city all the time, swooping down over the main square of the city and machine gunning people in the streets. One afternoon, my father and I were walking through the square and we heard the fighter planes coming. And we threw ourselves down on the ground and they swooped down over us, and just after they passed us, we heard ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta, the machine guns, and people were falling down, people were getting shot in the streets. So after that we knew that it was time to flee again. The only place left to go and try and find refuge was in the mountains. So my father was able to secure forged documents stating that we were Christians. And we started out on foot towards the mountain ranges, which were a good distance away. It was the end of September already. The weather was changing, it was getting colder, and we, along with thousands of people, were marching on these roads, hoping to find safe haven, hoping to find refuge somewhere in the mountains. And as we approached the mountain range one day, it started to rain. A rainstorm developed that was just awful. And we were completely exposed to the elements. And we finally reached the forest. And we go into the forest. And the rain is coming down. It's getting dark. And we hear, all we hear is the thunder and lightning. And from down below the forest, we hear loudspeakers in German calling to all the refugees to stop, to give up. And we see searchlights scanning the forest, the edge of the forest. And we try to go deeper and deeper and deeper into the forest to get away from the Germans, because we knew they were down below. So we're climbing in the mud, in the darkness, and the rain. We're going higher and higher into the forest. And then in the darkness, we suddenly realized that my sister, Eva, wasn't with us. She disappeared in the dark. People were scattering because they were afraid of the Germans. And my sister disappears. And we're standing there in the rain, in downpour, calling her name. Eva, Eva, Eva! Eva, where are you? There was no answer. And people would just pass us. And we find ourselves standing there in the forest all alone, in the darkness, with the rain coming down, and the lightning and the thunder. It's a very, very scary situation. And my father says, well, we can't stay here. We have to keep moving. We have to keep moving to get away from the Germans. Who knows where they are? So we continue on into the darkness, into the forest. For hours, we are soaking wet. We are just exhausted, cold. We finally give up and we stop under the trees. We stop under the trees and we settle down on the wet ground and huddle together, the three of us, hoping that the rain would stop, hoping that the storm would end. And by morning, the storm had ended. And the three of us are there. There's not a human being anywhere in sight. So my father says, I'm going to go and get a sense of where we are to get a sense of which way we should continue going. And I said, Dad, please don't leave us. Please, if you leave us, you're not going to find us again. And what are we going to do then? We'll be lost completely. And he says, I promise you that I will come back shortly. I'm just going for a little while. And my father left us, and I was sitting there frightened that he may not find his way back. But luckily he did. He came back a while later, and he said that he found a stream running down the mountain not too far from where we were. And he said, if I figure it right, the stream must be running alongside a village somewhere. So if we just continue our trek along the stream, we'll find a village. And hopefully we can find some shelter there. So we continued our trek for hours. And by late afternoon, we came upon this tiny little hamlet of about 10 houses. And we started knocking on doors, asking to be taken in. And the villagers would say, we don't know who you are. You may even be Jews. We don't want you here. We don't like Jews. We don't want you here. Go away. So we went to the next house. And the next house. And we were showing them our forged documents. They didn't want to see the documents. Finally, we came to one farmhouse where the farmer listened to our story and he believed us. And he said, all right, you can stay with my family. They were a large family. There were about 10 people living in a fairly small house. But they provided us with 2 cots and some food. And they looked at us very suspiciously as to why are we there, why are we running away from the Germans, even though we had a story all made up. But they learned to accept us after a couple of days. Now this was already late October by now. The weather changed. It got very cold. All the leaves fell off the trees, and the farmers were saying, there's going to be snow soon. And when the snow comes, the roads around here will become impassable. Germans will never come here because these roads cannot be traversed. These roads cannot be passed. So we were hoping and praying that Germans would never show up until one morning when we woke up and we looked out the window, and there must have been a few hundred German troops on the one street that ran through the town. This is a picture that I copied out of Google Earth of the village that we ended up in. If you pass it around carefully, please, you can see the houses, and you can see the fact that we're surrounded by forests. So that's the village we were settling in. And that one morning, even though everything was covered with snow, and we looked out the window, and there were several hundred German troops with trucks and tanks and all kinds of equipment on the main street of the village. And before long, 2 German soldiers came walking into the house, checking everyone's identity papers and asking if there are any Jews there. And they said, if there are any Jews here, if you're hiding any Jews or any partisans, they were the resistance fighters who were up in the mountains. If you're hiding any of those people, you better turn them into us. Otherwise, you'll be punished. And we were just hoping and praying that no one would say anything about us being outsiders. And they were satisfied with our documents, the Germans, and they left. that night, we're all getting ready to go to sleep. We went to sleep very early. There was nothing to do at night. There was no electricity there, only kerosene lamps. There were no books. The only thing you could do is go to sleep early, wake up early, and wait for the next night to come. So, just as we were getting ready to go to bed, everybody in that family slept in one room. And there were these cots spread out all over. My mother had a narrow cot, my father and I had a slightly wider one that we shared. So we're getting ready to go to bed and there's pounding on the front door. There's pounding on the front door. The farmer opens the door and there are 3 German soldiers there, 3 Nazi soldiers. One is an officer and the other 2 are foot soldiers. They come walking into the house. They walk into the house and they say, we need a place to sleep. We need a place to sleep. And the officer is looking around, and he points to a bed. That was the bed that my father and I would sleep in. And he points to that bed and he says, I'm going to sleep in that bed. And he proceeds to take his gear off, putting it all on the floor. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I'll sit back down again. He puts his rifle on the floor, machine gun, whatever it was, pulls off his boots and tells the other 2 soldiers to spread their blankets on the floor. And he goes and settles down in our bed. So at this point, my parents and I, the 3 of us, are trying to squeeze into this very narrow cot that my mother would sleep in. And the officer sees this and says, you don't have to do that. You don't have to do that. Let the little boy sleep in my bed. And we say, no, it's all right. We can manage. No, let the little boy sleep in my bed. It's a big enough bed. So my parents didn't want to protest too much. But they didn't want me to sleep in the same bed with a Nazi soldier. And, but he's insisting that I move over and sleep in his bed. It was scary. You can imagine how scary that was. I didn't want to sleep in the same bed with a Nazi. I was afraid. I was really afraid that something terrible might happen. But he insisted, and if we had protested too much, we were worried that he would become suspicious of us. So I moved over, got into his bed, turned my back to him. He fell asleep right away, fortunately. He fell asleep. And I reached out to my mother, who was in the cot next to us, and held her hand all through the night, staying wide awake, being vigilant, not sleeping a moment, waiting for the night to end. And my mother was clutching my hand. And finally, at dawn, thank you, at dawn, the Germans got up at first light. They got themselves dressed, and they even said thank you, and they left. They left the house. I cannot describe the fear that I experienced that night. There are no words to describe it. But the Germans were gone, so we were safe. They stayed in the village for a week, for one whole week. Every day, soldiers would come into the house checking our identity papers. We never left the house. The only time we walked out was in the evening to the outhouse, which is in back of the residential house, so we could relieve ourselves. That's the only time we walked out of the house. They came every day checking identity papers. We passed. Finally, on the, I believe it was the 7th night, in the middle of the night, there was pounding on the front door. We were awakened from sleep. And the farmer opens the door, and there is a Nazi officer, an SS officer, with the SS insignia, standing at the door with his flashlight shining into the farmer's face. He pushes the farmer to the side, walks into the room where everybody's in bed, and he goes from one person to the next, to the next, to the next with the flashlight, and finally stops, shines the light in my mother's face. He sits down on the edge of her cot, and he says to her, I know who you are. I know you're a Jew. You are here with your husband and your son. The villagers have turned you in. We are leaving here early in the morning. We're leaving this village early in the morning. I tore up the report about you being Jews, so you're safe. But after we leave, you should leave this village as soon as you can, because there'll be other troops coming here, and the villagers will turn you in again. And you won't be so lucky to have me around. And he said to my mother, do you hear me? Do you understand me? She said, yes. He says, all right, leave this village as soon as you can. And with that, he walked out. At dawn, we saw the Germans pulling out of the village. They were leaving. 2 days later, we got a farmer with a horse-drawn sled to take us to a different village where he knew some people, and he said he would be able to find us shelter. So we went for hours through the snowed-in roads and farm fields and whatnot, and we ended up in another village where we went through the same process again of asking for shelter, being told no, and then finally we came to a farming family where there were only women and children in the household. The men apparently were off in a coal mine working during the winter, and this farmer who drove us there knew these people, and he was able to convince them to take us in. He told them we're nice people, that we're not Jews, we just escaped the Germans from our hometown, which is another part of the country, etc., etc., etc. And they took us in. So we settled in with this family. It was a large family also. We settled in with them, and periodically Nazis came to the village, and we would see them early in the morning surrounding the village. And the woman said, look, you look different from us. You look like city people. I'm going to hide you. And she would hide us in the cellar, in a potato cellar in the barn. And we would stay in that cellar sometimes overnight, sometimes 2 days, because the Germans were in the village. It wasn't safe to come out. We would hear their footsteps directly overhead on the floor of the barn. We would hear them talking to each other. They were looking for Jews, they were looking for partisans. They would leave, we would be underneath there in that cellar, holding our breaths as long as they were in the barn. It was so scary, not knowing what moment they are going to discover us. They didn't find us. Came Christmas time. All the men of the house came home for the holidays. And there was one young guy, he was the son-in-law of the family. When he saw us, he says, "Who are these people? Who are you? Why are you here?" So we had a made-up story that we told him. He says, "You must be Jews. I don't want you here. You must get out of this house. I don't want you in this house. Get out of this house. Now." And we would say, "But where are we going to go? We are not Jews. Look, here are our birth certificates. Here are our papers. We're not Jews." And he was relentless. And finally, his mother-in-law would tell him to leave us alone. That we're nice people. Leave them alone. What do you want from them? So he would relent till the next day. Right after they stayed for Christmas, a few days after Christmas, it was the 30th of December. It was my father's birthday, as it happened. We woke up in the morning and the village was crawling with thousands of Germans. And before long, 2 German soldiers come walking into the house. There was no time for us to hide. 2 German soldiers come walking into the house with their machine guns. They tell all the men, they order all the men to take their papers and get their coats on and to go out to the street to be identified by an officer. So all the men, including my father, went out to the street. And then these 2 soldiers proceeded to check our documents, everybody else who was left in the house. And when they came to my mother and me, they looked in our faces, they looked at the pictures, and they said, "You're coming with us. Get your coats, you're coming with us." And I said to my mother, "Oh my God, we are dead, we are finished." My mother says, "Just be quiet and be hopeful, and everything is going to be all right." She bundled me up, she bundled herself up, and the 2 soldiers, with their guns pointing at us, walk us out of the house into the farmyard. We're walking towards the gate of the farmyard, out to towards the street, and all of a sudden one of the soldiers comes around to face us, and he says, and this time his gun is pointing down, and he says, go back, quickly go back." So we bewildered for a moment, and my mother grabs my hand, and we go back into the house. As soon as the door shuts, they walk out onto the street. The 2 soldiers walk out onto the street. And a few minutes later, all the men folk return from the street, and my father is not with them. We ask, "Where's my father?" The young guy says, the same one who was always giving us a rough time, says, your father, the officer took one look at him, and he said, "You did, Jew," and they let him away. So he's probably dead by now. They probably shot him. Which is better than being hanged. I mean, he was really getting pleasure out of this. He was so mean-spirited. He says, "So now, if your father is a Jew, you are Jews too. I want you out of this house." And I started to cry and to plead that the Germans made a mistake with my father. That he can't throw us out. It would be terrible, it would be cruel. Where would we go? And finally again, the woman of the house intervened, and she said, "Leave them alone. Isn't it bad enough that the father is gone? Just let them be. They're harmless, they're not hurting anybody." So we were allowed to stay, and the men went back to the coal mines a day or 2 later. So this time my father is gone, my sister Susan we haven't seen in over a year, and my sister Eva is gone too. She's lost somewhere in the forest, in the woods. So our lives were really just absolutely terrible. We were so depressed, we were so scared. My mother and I are so scared, not knowing what will happen to us. Germans came to the village a few more times, and the women hit us each time until they were gone. And then one day, a partisan woman walked into the house, total stranger, very tall and muscular, carrying a machine gun, wearing high boots, wearing a cap with a red Russian star on it. And she comes in, she's very friendly, she greets everybody, and finally the woman of the house asked her if she wants to have a cup of tea. And she sits down, she's sitting and talking to us. And she says, you know, we are up in the mountains and we are watching the Germans all the time. We see their movements all the time. We know when they come, we know when they're leaving. We are going to keep an eye on you, folks. But by the way, she turns to my mother. She says, by the way, is your name Serena? And my mother says, yes. She says, and is this your son, Paul? She says, yes. She says, I bring you greetings from your daughter, Eva. Eva is up in the mountains with us, with the partisans. When she was lost, we found her, we rescued her, and she's been with us ever since. And when I go down to the villages, she asked me to look around to see if I can find you, because she thinks you must be in one of the villages around here. So I will have good news for her, and I have good news for you. I found you, and you know about her whereabouts. I will be coming to this village on a regular basis, and I will warn you if the Germans are coming. But eventually you will have to leave this village. You'll have to cross over the mountains into the other side of the mountains, because that area is already liberated by the Russians. This side is still occupied by the Germans, and they're losing the war. They're losing the war, and they are desperate, and they are searching all the time for Jews and partisans or anybody else who doesn't belong in the villages. If they find them, they shoot them on the spot. So you will have to leave this village soon. I will tell you when. A couple of weeks later, it was already beginning of March, she comes one day and she says, tomorrow morning, you're leaving here. It's going to be a nice day. The weather will be perfect. You will cross over the mountains. It will be a very difficult crossing because the mountains are covered with snow. You'll cross over the mountains. And once you're over on the other side, you'll be in liberated territory. You'll be in liberated territory. And you'll be safe. Take nothing with you except enough food for a day. You'll be joined by other people who will be coming through here. The 10 of you together will cross over the mountains. You'll be safe. And sure enough, the next morning, there was a group of people coming through the village. We said goodbye to our hosts. We thanked them very much. And we joined this group of people. And we headed for this enormous snow-covered mountain. And we started climbing. It was a long, tedious climb. By late afternoon, we were pretty high up on the mountain. But the weather began to change unexpectedly. Suddenly the weather changed. The wind started to blow. It became overcast. It started snowing. And next thing we knew, we were caught in the middle of a blizzard. It was a horrible, horrible blizzard. The wind was so fierce, we were not dressed adequately. We just kept climbing. It got dark. It was worse, much worse than the first time when we were caught in that rainstorm. And in the darkness, you couldn't see, and the snow started becoming icy. The wind was unbelievable. And it was slippery, and at one point I slipped, And I let go of my mother's hand, and I started sliding down in the darkness, not knowing where I was sliding to, where I was falling to. I tried to stop myself by digging my fingers into the snow, and the snow would let go, and I just kept sliding. I couldn't stop. Finally, I landed on some kind of a plateau, pitch darkness. And I'm calling my mother from there. I'm yelling, "Mom, mother, mother, mother! Where are you? I'm down here. Come and find me." And she heard my voice. And she started yelling back, "Keep calling me so I can know, so I can hear where you are. I'll try and find you." And she sat down on the icy snow and slid down in the darkness, not knowing where she would end up. And luckily, she landed right near me. She landed right near me. And by that time, I was desperate. I was so cold, I thought I was just going to die. And the cold made me so sleepy. And my mother put her arms around me and held me tight and kept saying to me, "Paul, don't fall asleep. Don't fall asleep. You will die. You will freeze to death if you fall asleep. Don't fall asleep. Don't fall asleep." And she had some sugar left that she brought with her. And she kept feeding me this sugar. She said, "Eat that sugar. It's going to give you more energy. But don't, whatever you do, do not fall asleep." And she kept this ongoing all night long, telling me not to fall asleep and shaking me to be awake. If you fall asleep, you will die, you will freeze. And she kept me awake all through the night until the sun came up. And we found ourselves over the top of the mountain. It was a beautiful sunny morning. Not a human being anywhere in sight. We didn't know what happened to the people we were with. And the only place for us to go was down the mountain, hoping that we had indeed crossed over. So we began trudging through the deep snow for hours. At one point we saw an arm sticking out of a snowdrift. And we went running over there as fast as we could to see who it is. It was one of the people from our group, covered with ice, dead, frozen. My mother covered my eyes and pulled me away. She said, "I don't want you to see that. Let's just keep going." And we kept going all day long until finally we saw the trees down below, the forest down below, because we were above the tree line. And we headed towards the forest, and we noticed smoke rising from among the trees in the forest. So we headed in that direction. And finally we entered the forest and came upon a group of log cabins, about 3 or 4 log cabins, and there were several saddled horses tied to a post outside the cabin, and the smoke was rising from the chimney of this one cabin. So, not knowing who might be there, whether it be friend or foe, knocked on the door. I knocked on the door, and the door opened, and there was this big, tall Russian in a uniform, in a Russian uniform, looking at us and says, "Who are you? What do you want?" And I said, "We escaped the Germans. We crossed over the mountains in the blizzard. Please, can we come in? We need some warmth. We need some food. We're frozen cold." So he brought us in, and there were several other Russians there. And they wanted to know who we were, so we told them. Wanted to know where we are from, we told them. They said, "You know, your town, your city was liberated in November. This was the beginning of March. You are now safe." And they gave us blankets to sleep on, they gave us food, and bedded down on the floor. God, is that loud? And we stayed with the Russians for several days. They gave us directions on how to try and get home, back to our hometown. And after a week, it took us 1 week to work our way back home. Through freight trains, farm wagons, military trucks, sleeping in railway stations, on the floor, getting food from soldiers. We found our way home. We got off the train, a freight train, early one morning, and we're walking into town. And I turned to my mother, I said, all right, we are here, what now? What do we do? Who do we know here? Who is left here that we know? Are there going to be any friendly people here? And she says, somehow it will, she was always hopeful. And we're standing in the center of town. It was a small city. Standing in the center of town, looking around to see which way to go. And all of a sudden we hear somebody calling out our names, our first names. Serena, Paul. And we turn around and there's a friend of our family looking out the window. He recognized us and he comes running out, hugging us, kissing us. Oh my God, you survived, you're safe. You have to come and stay with us. So he brought us into their home. And you can stay here as long as you need to. This is your home. And we settled in with them. The war ended in May. We didn't know what was going on besides, except for the fact that the war was still ongoing in parts of Europe. In May, the war ended, May 8th, I believe. A few days later, my sister Eva showed up. She made it over the mountains and came home. In beginning of June, my father came home. He was taken to, after he was captured, he was taken to a concentration camp in Germany. He was this thin when he came home. He looked like a skeleton. But he survived. So now 4 of us were alive. Finally, beginning of August, my sister Susan, who we haven't seen in a year and a half, she and one of my aunts came home together. They found each other in another concentration camp in Germany, a camp called Bergen-Belsen, sorry. And they came home. And out of my entire family, there were 6 of us who survived. The fact that my immediate family survived was a sheer miracle, because not many families survived. So few people made it back. My hometown, which used to have a Jewish population of over 5,000 people, less than 300 people came back. To bring the story to an end, we decided we cannot stay there. We do not want to stay there. It took us a long time. We wanted to come to America because we had some relatives here. And it took us a long time before we were able to do that, to come to America, because there was a quota system where people from different countries had quotas and only so many people were allowed into the United States. So finally we managed to leave Czechoslovakia because the communists took over Czechoslovakia. And we spent a year in Vienna, Austria, where we finally obtained our American visas and came to the United States. I arrived in the United States on March 12, 1951. And the rest is history. still have some time.
So, 8th graders, we have about 15 minutes-ish. Everybody can take a second to stretch.
Well, it's really high.
Folks, at this point, thank you for being a pretty good audience. We know that people have been sitting for a while and some people want to use the restroom. We're going to try to get that happening. But we also know there are some people who have some questions. Okay? And so, in order to be both respectful of Mr. Galan and his ability to answer these questions, and respectful of the fact that people have these questions, I want to maintain the same kind of atmosphere that we had. You guys are really a pretty good audience. I want to maintain that through the question asking phase, and then you'll be off to lunch momentarily. So just kind of try to hold it together for another 10 minutes with some of these questions, and then afterwards you can come up and, Mr. Galan on for that. So I'm going to try to announce the names of the people who are asking questions so that everybody knows kind of where to direct their attention in the room so that you can continue to demonstrate that you're being a really good listener. All right? So Walter's got a question. He's right over here.
Go ahead, Walter.
Did you ever see that Nazi soldier again?
I'm sorry?
Did you ever see that Nazi soldier again, the one that helped you?
Never.
Chris, you got a question right here in front?
Have you ever gone back to Germany?
He said, have you ever gone back to Germany?
Not to Germany. I've been to Germany, but that was not where going back meant. I was from Czechoslovakia. Yes, I have gone back. Yes,
Do you speak German?
a little bit. I studied German post-war in school. And I spent a year in Vienna where German is spoken, so I learned German pretty well.
Yeah, Brian's in the way back in the corner over here. You're gonna have to be nice and loud, Brian.
Where are you, Brian?
Do you have numbers?
No, I do not have numbers. The numbers were only tattooed on people who were brought to a camp called Auschwitz in Poland. That was the only place where people were tattooed numbers. But speaking of numbers, those people who were in the camps, they lost their identity. They were not human beings to the Germans. They were only known by numbers.
Wow.
So they either had a number tattooed, or I will show you something that my father was given because he was never taken to Auschwitz. He had a patch with a number on it. And that patch was sewn on his uniform. Everybody was given a striped uniform. And that was his number. Yes, more
You
questions.
got, Raynice has a question, and then we'll go over to Marcus, and then Terry.
Go ahead.
Raynice is over
Did
there.
you ever find out what happened to your other sister?
Hold on, I'm sorry. Say that a little louder.
Did you ever find out what happened to your other sister? The other one, not
Ava?
You said two.
Susan, yes, yes. The one who was not at home when they came to take us away.
Yeah.
She was in hiding for a long time. And then she moved to the capital city of the country, to Bratislava. That's the name of the city. Because it was easier to get lost there, in a big city. And one day she ran into somebody on the street who was from our hometown, who recognized her, a Christian person, and turned her into the Gestapo. And she was arrested and taken to Auschwitz, to the camp Auschwitz. And from there she was sent to another camp called Bergen-Belsen, where she was deathly ill with typhus. And my aunt, one of my aunts, was in the same camp, and she found out that my sister was there. And she found her and helped nurse her back to relative health. And the two of them came home together.
Marcus?
Did anyone in your family really foresee the Holocaust?
Not to the degree, not to its extreme.
And I also
I mean, people, yes, not just family, but people became. Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933. And part of Hitler's long-term plan was the annihilation of all Jews. However, no one expected that he was going to invade all of Europe and be victorious for a while. So it wasn't until 1939 when Czechoslovakia lost its identity and became part of the Nazi protectorate, or whatever you want to call it, that people began to see that the future was very bleak.
Tyson, you had a question?
It was answered.
Okay, Jared?
Where is she located?
I'm sorry?
Where is the?
Where's the
Czechoslovakia?
Czechoslovakia?
Yeah, where is it actually located?
It's in the eastern, east central Europe. It borders on Hungary. It borders on Poland. And when it was Czechoslovakia, Bohemia bordered on Germany.
Is it still called Czechoslovakia?
Well, it was after the war, after the defeat of the Nazis, it was re-established as Czechoslovakia, and it remained Czechoslovakia until 1994 or 95, when the Czechs and the Slovaks decided to separate their countries. So it's Slovakia and the Czech Republic. And if you look it up on a map of Europe, you can find it.
We're gonna go back to Walter right here in front.
Yes.
Sorry about the jet crafts. I don't
You
control
have no
them.
control over it.
Speak loudly, Walter.
How did you feel when the Germans released the anti-Jew propaganda?
When they went,
Released the anti-Jew propaganda?
Sorry about the propaganda.
oh, it was frightening. It was frightening because they were talking about you. And they were depicting you as a very vile, mean, ugly human being. They painted pictures of Jews, supposed Jews, on the walls of buildings. People with long noses and being fat and clumsy looking and very rich. They created images that was so gross, so extreme, that some people who were not particularly well educated were believing it. That was all part of this dehumanizing process. Yes? Oh,
We're gonna go with Dimitri, then Kieran, then Alishare.
go ahead.
If you could change one thing, what would you change?
About my experiences, or about what happened to me? What happened to me?
What happened?
The only thing I would change is I would never, God bless you, I would never have allowed a Hitler to gain power. And I would try to do what I'm doing now. You know what anti-Semitism is? Anti-Semitism is a term which means anti-Jewish. Jews are considered Semites. In America, everybody is equal. There may be anti-Semitism among certain people, but as a whole, America is truly a democracy. And I am here sharing with you a horror story in order for you to remember never to hate. Never to hate. To accept people for what they are. Whether they are black, whether they are yellow, whether they are brown, whether they are Jews, Christians, Protestants, Lutherans, any Muslims, any religion. Accept people on the basis of their humanity, of the kinds of human beings that they are. And that's what I've changed. That's what I would have changed. But unfortunately, I was taught how important it is by surviving the horrors of the Holocaust. So that is the one thing that I would change.
Okay, Ron,
Yes.
I don't know if anybody acts this already,
A little louder, please.
but I don't know if anybody else acts this already, or any of your siblings or parents still alive.
Unfortunately, my parents have been gone for a while. My father was 90 years old. My mother was almost 100 when she passed away. I lost my sister Ava 2 years ago to Alzheimer's disease. And my sister Susan is still alive, but she is also suffering from Alzheimer's. So for all intents and purposes, she's only alive physically. But otherwise, she's really gone.
I'm sorry.
Thank you. Yes, you had a question? No? Oh, I'm sorry. Who did? Oh, you did. I'm sorry. Go on.
When did you start going to school again?
I started going to school 2 weeks after I arrived in this country.
At what age were you at?
I was 16, almost 16 years old.
You went to first grade?
No. 16? No, I went into high school. We all make mistakes. I went to high school. I started in first year of high school until I learned to speak English, which didn't take a long time. And then I was accelerated. So I went to high school for 2.5 years. And I graduated high school with high honors.
Kino has a question, then Emily, then Isaiah.
All right. What's your question, please?
Do you have any kids?
I'm sorry?
Do you ever have any kids?
Do I have kids? Yes, I do. I have a son and daughter, and they have children of their own.
You told them all the story?
Oh, yes.
Emily and Isaiah.
Yes.
When did you get married?
When did I get married? In 1957, I married my high school sweetheart.
Isaiah, and then we're going to start wrapping it up. Isaiah.
Please, give Isaiah a chance. Isaiah, go ahead.
How did the German soldiers tell if like someone was German or Jewish?
Jewish people look different ethnically or from the Slovak people. They look different from the German people. German people look very different from Americans. Germans are known to be blonde and blue-eyed and very fair-skinned. Russians have broad faces and very strong muscular bodies. I mean, every nationality has a different look that evolves among them. So we look different from the Slovak people. Now there's one other thing that I'm going to mention, and don't laugh about it. It's written in the Bible that every Jewish child who is born is to be circumcised on his 7th day. On the 7th day from his birth. In Europe, in this country, majority of children are circumcised for health reasons. In Eastern Europe, that was uncommon. The only people who were circumcised were Jewish children. The reason I was so frightened to be sleeping in the same bed with the German officer was that he might accidentally see that I was circumcised. In some countries, the Nazis would capture people, and if the people were denying that they were Jews, they were in public places, including trolley cars, which is what they did in Hungary. They would make men drop their pants in public to see whether they were circumcised.
I think we've got Mason, then Jada, and then we are. Okay, Mason, you have a question? Last question? Right now.
So, were you ever reunited with any early childhood friends?
Yes.
Like before? No.
But after the war, a few of my friends survived. We were reunited. Yes.
But then when the Nazi propaganda spread throughout all the countries that had been occupied, did it ever actually, at one point, did you ever think, or feel, guilty, or feel like you've done something wrong by the Nazi propaganda?
No, never felt guilty, never felt that did anything wrong.
All right, folks, you guys unfortunately have a schedule to keep. I know a lot of you are going to want to come up and personally thank Mr. Galan for being here, but one more round of applause, please. Yeah, we're so fortunate.
You were a wonderful group.